Welcome, everybody. Good morning and hello. My name is Dayal. This is Spirit Matters, your daily Bhakti Center podcast. And I'm with my good friend, soul brother, and soul sister, Kishore Chandra and Acyuta Gopi. How are you guys doing?
I'm doing great. I'm super happy to be here with all of you. It's literally, we're only 3 days in and it's turned into the highlight of my morning.
Highlight of my morning and evening when I listen to these recordings. I listen to it when I've got my headphones and my wife's like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "I'm listening to my podcast."
That's right. If you don't make a podcast that you yourself want to listen to, does it count then? Like,
Yeah, I love it. I love listening. I love listening to you guys. It's beautiful. How are you doing this morning, Achuta?
I'm good, grateful, super happy to be here.
Beautiful, wonderful. I had a personal question, and this is just something popped up that I was gonna pop quiz on you. Have you ever looked into or know much about the Enneagram?
Yeah, I
Do
did. I
you?
looked into it like kind of briefly, and then it's like a little iceberg, you know. You start here, but then there's like this whole mountain of things underneath, and
Do you know
it
your
wound up
type?
telling me so much about my personality. I didn't know if I wanted all of that info.
Yeah, it's like, can I close that book? Do you know your type?
I used to know it and then I forgot it because, you have like so many different layers of types, not just like one particular number. You've got like a
Yeah,
number here with like shadows of this one, different aspects of that
yeah.
one.
Okay, well, Rukmini's joining on here in a second. Let's see if she pops in. Rukmini, I brought up the Enneagram just because I was listening to Chuta and I was like relating so much, and I was like, I think we're related. So we'll get into that in another episode, but I wanted to have that connection. Kishore and I have mirror types. We're very similar, and
Ooh.
I was feeling that you might also be in the club with yeah, which is when you find that it's very validating and reassuring. You got your little tribe. You're like, I'm not the only one that thinks this way. And so, okay, we'll bring that up. We'll bring that up at another time. But yesterday we were talking about surrender and what surrender means. And this morning, Kishore was going to tell us about his experience of childbirth, because that's what Achuta did yesterday. No. But you mentioned that Achuta as your moment of surrender. Um, and if there's nothing else that you guys have specifically on that, I had a question I was going to ask, because that's what I do. I'm the announcer and I just volley the questions to you guys so that I don't have to share anything personal and vulnerable. But before I just launch into that, I wanted to check if there's something that was on your guys' mind that you wanted to dive into first.
I mean, I feel like I definitely kind of wanted to hear more from Kishore, just like, intro to the topic, because we left off with him yesterday. And then
We did.
he posted such an amazing like little reel on
Ooh.
Instagram. So now I have to put you on the spot. Sorry, bro.
Whoopee.
Yeah, okay, I'm happy to talk. Yeah, I think surrender is just with surrender, I find that it's one of those things that like on a knowledge basis or even like when we're just hearing it, it sounds depends where you're at, but it sounds kind of deep and awesome and exciting sometimes. It's like, yeah, I got to surrender, I got to be open and all of this stuff. But again, I'm feeling that like it can sometimes be overwhelming, because like I think something I've noticed with a lot of people that I've spoken to about surrender is that it's one of those words that like it sounds really cool and big and exciting, but what does it actually mean? Like what does it actually look like? What is the lived experience of surrender? And when we're not necessarily hearing stories about what that looks like, I think you can be kind of like lost in that experience. And I just remember this memory that I have of one of our dear friends. Her name is Champak. And I remember like back in the day when it was pre-COVID times and we were just having so many people walking in and out of the Bhakti Center at all times. And reception was always kind of like this hot spot. Like everyone would just hang out at reception and get into conversations for hours and hours and a half. Jai Jagannath would be sitting at reception and you just get lost in conversation with him. And Champak was one of these beautiful people that was at reception. And I remember one day I was just like lost in conversation with her. I had a million things to do, But I was just like, whatever. Here I am at reception talking to Champak for an hour. And we were talking about this topic of surrender. And she just said to me, she was like, surrender is a moment to moment, minute to minute, second to second process. And I was just like, it felt simultaneously good. I was just like, yeah, you're right. That's true. And then it felt kind of like scary and overwhelming. Like, oh my God, I have to surrender every moment, every minute, every second. And, just what I shared yesterday, I shared this thing about kind of authenticity and being yourself. And I think a lot of the times, what I was trying to share yesterday, and I'll end with this, is that I think a lot of the times we think we have to like show up as 100%, 150% all the time, or whatever it is that we're offering to our friends or the world. It has to like be this certain way. And I feel like there's a lot of shame or guilt, or not sure what the word is, but just unease about not being productive or like not showing up 150% all the time. Our culture has a very messed up relationship with rest and with kind of just like going through the emotions as well, like going through the quote unquote negative emotions. And so what I was saying yesterday in the reel was really just like, yeah, Krishna just wants us in all of our imperfectness as well. Like that's also a part of the surrender. It's not like our surrender has to look like this perfect, it's my perfect surrender journey and it looks so great from A to B, It's not necessarily like that. I mean, if we think of Bhagavad Gita, like at the beginning, Arjuna is having this like whole complete existential breakdown, and it's not pretty, it's actually quite intense. And therefore, this dark night of the soul, I think, is there for us as an example to know that like we can also have that, and we can also go through that, and it doesn't have to be this like cookie cutter journey. And Krishna actually wants that from us. And I'll leave off with this, that I mentioned this verse from Bhagavad Gita. Towards the end of Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says that it's better to follow one's own dharma or path imperfectly than to try to follow someone else's path or dharma perfectly. And therefore, like what I hear from that is like, yeah, Krishna's like totally happy with our imperfections. And actually that's part of the journey. And actually he wants that more than us trying to pretend to be something that we're not, or trying to pretend to be someone that we're not. And for me, that's really liberating when it comes to surrender, because it's not like my surrender has to look like this cookie cutter thing. It's like, it can be messy, and it probably will be.
Hashtag perfect surrender. Yeah. I love seeing you get all these. I'm just going to jump in and say a couple of things, and then I want to hear more from Acyuta. One is that verse from the Gita that you quoted. Did you know that that's one of only two verses that's repeated twice in the Gita? There are two verses repeated twice in the Gita. One is the Manmana Bhava Madbhakto 9:30 or 31, and then the 18th chapter, just have your mind think of me. And then that verse verbatim, the Sanskrit is repeated twice, to do your own duty, even if perfectly. And then I was just chuckling a little bit at the idea of like perfect surrender, because you see so many things on Instagram, and I'm just gonna like poke a little fun here. You get people like on a beach in like a swimsuit with like a martini, and it just says like, sometimes you just gotta surrender, and they're like in the sunset or something like that, and it's just, sometimes we got this idea of like surrender and it's being like this like romantic. And I always remember, I've referenced this at different times, like a while ago, there was this episode of Seinfeld, or Seinfeld was telling a joke. Jerry was telling a joke, when he does those skits before an episode, and he was talking about how like, things in commercials always seem more exciting than they are in real life, and like, people are, they're spiking volleyballs and they're slam dunking, and like you got your 7-Up and you're like, maybe there's not enough ice in my glass, because it's not as romantic in our real life, and we see it in the movies or we see it on social media or whatever, and then it comes to our life. And this is something that I was thinking I wanted to volley to you, Acyuta, because you gave an example of surrender in a very specific, like intense instance, like when you were giving birth. And it's kind of like, yeah, when there's that intensity of a moment, like what it means to surrender, like when there's a crisis. But sometimes a lot of surrender, it's more drawn out. It's like it's in the just like the long moments of loneliness, or it's in the long moments of like, I don't have a partner and I don't know if I'll ever find one, or I'm in between jobs, or I'm in a job that I don't like. Our life just seems drab and drawn out. And so it's like, it's one thing when surrender means like, okay, just pushing through, or like literally pushing through when you gave birth. But like, what does surrender look like when it's more just kind of like in the in between long, the waiting moments, or the we're kind of in the desert, and it's like, okay, surrender. It's like, to what? How? What do you mean? Just wait?
Yeah, I really, really, really love how these conversations are all kind of like divinely led and guided and arranged. Because just before this, I was kind of looking up some of my favorite quotes on surrender.
Mm.
And one section comes from this book, Return to Love, A Course in Miracles.
Oh
You
my
know that
God.
one?
Read it twice.
Right? So good. So Marianne Williamson, for everybody else who doesn't know, has written kind of like this commentary on A Course in Miracles, which is like old school book, and it has a lot of like Christ theology, but she kind of takes it at a more broader view, and she writes about surrender within the context of what it means within A Course in Miracles and what it means for us right now, what it could mean for the world. Also, 6 degrees of separation. She met Radhanath Maharaj, okay?
When?
Yeah, years ago, some years
What?
ago.
Didn't know that.
Yeah,
I used to go see her speak in New York City because she used to speak at a church. She's kind of taken a little different of a route these days. She got into the political
yeah,
realm
yeah.
recently, and I've read a couple of her books. Her earlier work is like her greatest stuff, in my opinion.
Mhm.
And Return to Love was right there. But that's so
Yeah,
cool.
yeah, isn't it? I remember Rannath Maharaj was telling me, and he was also telling my family, and he was saying that he'd met Marianne Williamson. She's like a lovely person, and she still had these like burning spiritual questions that she wound up
Mm.
asking him. And I just remember thinking, I was like, that is so cool. And then like
Mm.
after I was like telling my mom, I was like, have you read it? She's like, no. I was like, okay, this is my life. Okay, fine.
Your mom's like, you kids are cute.
Yeah, so in that Return to Love, she writes, the moment of surrender is not when life is over, it's when it begins. Not that moment of eureka, that calling out to God is it and it's all paradise from then on. You've simply started the climb, but you know you're not running around in circles at the bottom of the mountain anymore, never really getting anywhere, dreaming of the top and having no idea how to get there. For many people, things have to get very bad before there's a shift. When you truly bottom out, there comes an exhilarating release. You recognize there's a power in the universe bigger than you are who can do for you what you can't do for yourself. All of a sudden, your last resort sounds like a very good idea. How ironic. You spend your whole life resisting the notion that there's someone out there smarter than you, and then all of a sudden, you're so relieved to know it's true. All of a sudden, you're not too proud to ask for help. That's what it means to surrender to God.
Mm.
And that for me kind of encapsulates what you're saying. Like, what does the day to day surrender look like? The day to day surrender looks like I am not too proud to ask for help, no matter what's happening. I'm not too proud to understand that I'm smaller than all of this, right? There's that, you know, I kind of wrote a little bit about the idea of that Bhagavad Gita in that moment where Arjuna, like you said, has this complete existential breakdown. But what comes out of it is the courage in confession, right?
Mm.
And I feel like that's what I want to bolster. There's a courage, there's a bravery in confessing that I don't have this under control. I'm a complete mess. I don't have it figured out. Even on the day to day, like I could wake up in the morning and I still don't have it figured out. Like we kind of think, oh, sleep on it. It'll be better in the morning. What happens when it's not? What happens when you sleep on it and it's exactly the same the next day? And I feel like
Mm.
that's what it means for me, those everyday moments. It just means that I'm not too proud to ask for help.
Mm. Being honest.
Yeah.
Um, I was thinking of a verse from the Gita at the end of the fifth chapter where Krishna says, um, Bhoktaram yagatapasam sarva loka maheshwaram suhrida sarvadehinam yatvamam shantim richati, that he says that I am the Lord of the universe, I am the master of everything, the controller. And he says all of those things. And then he says, Suhradam Sarvadehinam. I said, I'm also the well wishing friend of everyone.
Hmm.
And I think that is so, I think he says that for a reason. And I think he says that in that order for a reason. Because it's one thing that's like, the first couple lines, Bhoktaram Yagatapasam, I'm the enjoyer of all sacrifices. Sarva Lokam Maheshwaram, I'm the Lord of all the universe. It's like, great. Well, you could still be a tyrant, you know. You can be the god of fear and all of this and all of those things. But then he says, I'm also your well-wishing friend. And in the end of the Gita, where you brought up this verse yesterday from the 18th chapter, where he says, Sarva Dharmam Prityaja, that surrender unto me. And we usually quote that first part of the verse, surrender, surrender, surrender. But then there's that second part of the verse, which is so critical, which is Masuchaha, do not fear, I will protect you. And interestingly enough, I've heard this, I've never gone through and counted myself, but that the number one most repeated command in the entire Bible, you know what it is? Fear not. Be not afraid. Don't fear. It's the number one repeated phrase, command throughout the entire Bible. And it's the final instruction of Krishna to Arjuna. And he's saying, don't fear because I'm your friend. I'm your supreme best friend. Acyuta figured it out. She already knew this. And so, but it's that, and I think it's surrender, perhaps more than anything, is just being willing to walk through life knowing that I'm not alone. I've quoted this oftentimes, Trevor Hall, who I love and listen to his music. He wrote this song, one of my favorite songs, called Indigo, which I don't know what the word indigo means, but the lyrics say, I've got to play like a child in her lap, no defending, no attack. I know that spirit's got my back. And so this idea of just kind of like moving through life knowing that I don't have to have it all together. And that just like I'm not alone and somebody else is working behind the scenes to figure it out. Because I think that's where so much of the fear and anxiety comes from. It's like, because sometimes the moment itself isn't so terrible. It's the forecasting that really gets us into trouble. It's going to be this way forever. I'm not going to find a way out. It's not that I don't have a partner. It's that I'm never going to find a partner. It's not that I'm, tired today. It's like I'm going to be lonely the rest of my life, or things are never going to work out, etc. And recognizing like, oh, I'm totally not alone, and I can trust that somebody else is working behind the scenes and using this for a powerful reason. And so I'm so glad you brought that up. That was powerful to me.
What I really love is actually what I thought was really interesting was Kishore's definition of surrender. And so when you were talking about surrender and you're like, it could sound like this really awesome word, like big concept, like, oh, I just got to be open and be free. And I'm like, huh. Because as a Krishna kid, like growing up, I feel like surrender was one of the things that we were most afraid of. Like surrender, at least, for my generation of like, second generation bhakti kids, kind of felt like that's when you lose everything. That's when Krishna decides, I'm going to take everything away from you. And that's what surrender means. Surrender means like everything that you've valued and you've worked hard for and you feel like you've gotten is gone. And it took me a really kind of a long time to kind of like deconstruct that idea in my own heart and in my mind and in my soul, to then come to a point where it's like, wait a second. It doesn't mean once I surrender, it really doesn't mean that I'm giving up on a situation. It also doesn't mean that Krishna is this evil person who's just waiting to take away all of the great things that I like about life because he just wants me to struggle through this material existence and go back to where I need to be.
I can't wait for you to get 1 million followers, Acyuta, because I'm going to take them away as soon as you get them. Hashtag perfect surrender.
Exactly. Yeah. So, now getting a chance to like look at these different like views of what surrender actually is, getting a chance to kind of research what these actual examples are. In bhakti yoga, you have a million different practitioners. None of their paths are exactly the same. And like 85-90% of them are all reaching the perfection of life somehow. Like if you look at the life of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and all of his associates, none of their paths look the same, and they're all reaching perfection and they're all surrendering. And then you hear about like Goswamis, Rupa Goswami, for example. And all my life, I'm like, yeah, he was a dude. goes to Vrindavan, renounces everything, sleeps under a different tree, kind of poor, done.
Good for
And
him.
then recently, recently, I'm like, see, that's surrender. You surrender, and then everything's lost. And then I heard recently, I was like, do you know he had 500 cows?
I did
He
not
was
know
the
that.
owner of 500 cows. He just he chose the simple life, but he had loads of wealth that he decided to use in the service of his beloved deities, Radha Govinda. Hey, but so then it's in that moment where I'm like, deconstruct it again, Acyuta. It's like surrender does not mean that Krishna's sitting around waiting to rip everything from you. Like if we look at Bhagavad Gita, he's urging Arjuna to fight because, and Srila Prabhupada says in Srimad Bhagavatam that Krishna wanted the Pandavas to rule the earth and be rich because they were his devotees. So that idea of I'm the well-wishing friend of everyone, like, yeah, why would my friend want me to be miserable? So that surrender for me is trusting that Krishna doesn't want me to be miserable. Even if I think like this situation looks like I'm miserable right now, I'm like, but actually, if I didn't trust and if I was in a different situation that I thought I had figured out, I might be more miserable than I am right now, just depending on my friend. So I've kind of taken that. So, so interesting to me, Kishore, when you were saying that, it's like this big idea. I was like, because I went through my life terrified of surrender.
Yeah, for me, I laughed when you said that because for me, I don't know if you know this is about me, Acyuta, but I grew up as like a hardcore traditional Jehovah's Witness. So for me, I grew up also terrified of surrender. And I think I was more referencing like the modern, what Doyal was kind of referencing, like the Instagram martini on the beach, just surrender to the coconuts and just do it. But I also grew up like, terrified of surrender.
Surrender to the coconuts.
Surrender to the
I feel
coconuts.
like that's the name of this episode.
That's the takeaway.
But I think just listening to what really I think can be scary for people sometimes for surrender is the idea that you have to kind of let go of ego. You have to go through a certain type of ego death, because Arjuna had like a certain conception of life, of who he was and what he was doing, and then Krishna came in and basically gave him an entire different of life. Because there's this verse in the Bhagavad Gita, which for me is one of my verses of the Bhagavad Gita, and whenever I teach Bhagavad Gita, it's what I focus on this verse a lot. It's chapter 2 verse 7, I think, kind of like that moment where Arjuna goes into surrender, this panya doshopahata swabhava prachami tvam dharma samud yat shayashyan nishitam bruhi tanme shishyastaham mam tvam prapanam. And my favorite part of this verse, this idea of shreyas versus preyas, or like what I think is good for me versus what is ultimately right. Because Arjuna is saying here, I'm experiencing this weakness of heart. I no longer know what is ultimately for me, and I am surrendering unto you as a disciple, like only what to do. And so this idea of like actually knowing what is good for me, it can sometimes be kind of scary. The idea that my life and my ideations and ideologies of like what I thought was right, like sipping coconuts on the beach and doing this whole lifestyle, like I thought that was me. And actually now it's like surrendering to a higher power might, like I have to again, I'm going to use this word, surrender, that like maybe my idea of what I thought for me isn't actually what was good for me, and that I think can be the most scary part. But I also think it's really liberating, as Acyuta says so much. You say this of like Krishna being our supreme friend, our supreme bestie, and it's like if I actually believe in that and trust that, then it's like, wow, okay, like I know that this divine person is taking care of me, and the tough times are there for me as a lesson, for me as like a jumping off point, something to learn from, because I was meditating also in bhakti. We have make to this a little bit more tomorrow because I know we're running out of time, but there's a lot of lists of bhakti. There's like the 64 angas of bhakti and the 9 C's of devotional service and the 9 stages of bhakti. There are these 6 aspects of surrender, and the first 2 aspects of surrender are understanding what is favorable for my life or for my bhakti and accepting that, and understanding what is not favorable for my spiritual life and my spiritual growth and rejecting that. All of you, but sometimes I get those two mixed up and I think that like, this thing is good for me, this coconut life on the beach is good for me, and actually it's not. And so therefore I think that's where surrender really comes in for me. It's like I can't remember if it was Doyal or Acyuta who said this at the beginning, but like asking for help, like knowing when I don't know and asking for help so that I can actually be more honest and humble in my path and reach the goal.
Hmm. Right now, there's somebody listening to this episode on a beach, sipping a coconut, having an existential moment. They're like, "Oh my god!" And they're
So
getting off
like
they're throwing the coconut like this. I'm out of here.
for that person, I say what Krishna also says in Bhagavad Gita, which is one of my favoritist things, is he tells Arjuna, he's like, "What will repression accomplish?" And that to me was
Mm,
so comforting. Oh man, it's been comforting because I really feel like Krishna's like, just do you. It's like, I'll handle the rest. Be sincere, be honest, be authentic, just do you. So he's like, don't sip. He's like not saying like don't sip the coconuts. Like, he
chug it, chug that coconut.
I'm saying, coconut water is good for you. Okay? It's filled
So
with
is sunshine, seawater.
I fully expect on the, Friday's episode, I need y'all both to have coconuts. Okay.
We're gonna coconut. Yeah, we're gonna be in Puerto Rico on Friday.
That's
We
what I'm
are.
saying. Okay?
We will
I
have
fully
coconuts.
expect.
We're gonna be surrendering out the wazoo. Mm,
Yeah, so like, what does this surrender look like when you have wealth, when you have all of these opulences, when you have these things, and then you realize it's a mindset. It's
mm,
a heart intention. And so, I feel like we can often judge like famous people and all these things like harshly, like, oh, their idea of surrender. You're like, how are they going to surrender? They've got all this stuff. And even in the time of Sri Chaitanya, there was one very like wealthy dude. He looked great. His hair was long. He's all like perfumed. And everybody's all like, you can't really be a bhakti yogi. You can't be a
mm,
Vaishnav. Like, what's that guy going to do? But he really was, because it didn't depend on the wealth and the opulence and how great
mm,
he looked and how handsome he was. It was a mindset and it was an intention
mm,
of the heart. And he found ways to surrender every day inside.
mm,
And I feel like there's a certain, a conviction. There's a decision and a conviction to say, I'm going to trust in my best friend. So Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj
mm,
also wrote about surrender. And he says, surrender opens the door to love. In the process of surrender, we are to accept that which is favorable and to reject that which is unfavorable. But in great times of complexities, what is to be considered unfavorable? Modern thought says, I have my truth, she has her truth, they have their truths. This type of thinking is demoniac, based on transitory considerations and ambiguities.
mm,
Ambiguity is Maya, because ambiguity opens the door for more ambivalence to come through. So that like vacillating nature, that lack of conviction, like thinking about that as actually a tendency which should be renounced. Like, I feel like that's actually renunciation, not necessarily when you renounce all the material things, but renouncing limiting beliefs and thoughts. Renouncing an
yeah.
internal dialogue, I feel, is more important. So when Krishna talks in Bhagavad Gita about divine and demoniac natures, I started looking at them like, what if I could accept the more like divine nature, which is this belief that Krishna is my friend. He's going to be there. I don't have to fear because spirit's got my back. And being able to renounce that demoniac nature, which is my mind saying, you'll never get there. You'll never find anybody. You're going to be lonely forever. You're never going to get over this hurdle. Everything's going to be ruined forever. That kind of ambiguity, that lack of conviction is actually working against our surrender.
Mm. I love that so much. And I love so far we've invoked Marianne Williamson, Jerry Seinfeld, Trevor Hall, and Bhakti Tirtha Swami. We've got an all-star cast and crew here. I love it, and we're gonna have to pick this up tomorrow because We're running out at the end here. And Kimberly, I'm gonna call you up, put you on the spot. You're our scribe. If you got some takeaways you can share with us, would love that. But what was coming to my mind as you were sharing, Achuta, is this kind of like, sometimes we have friends that we turn into a different person when we're around them. And some people are like, I don't like who you are when you're around so and so.
Hmm.
And it's kind of like that with our mind, like, oh, who we become if we treat like the thoughts in our mind like a social circle, you know? And it's like, oh, when you're around those thoughts, like you change, like your understanding of what you think is good for you all of a sudden shifts. And it's just like putting yourself in positive association mentally and internally, which is super, super powerful. And that learning that attachment and renunciation there. So I'd love to share that more tomorrow when we got more time. Um, Kimberly, are you gonna hate me if I ask you to share some of our takeaways?
No, it's all good.
Okay,
Thank
great.
thank you for the great discussion. I got out today that I can show up just as I am, and Krishna will meet me where I am at as a loving friend. And it can look imperfectly. It doesn't have to be perfect and cookie cutter like how I may see like in the media and online. And it can actually be pretty liberating to trust where I'm at, you know, to Krishna.
Beautiful. Love those takeaways. Thank you so much, Kimberly, for sharing. Thank you, Achuta and Kishore. Any closing words, burning desires before we cut it for today? They're surrendered. They're just content.
Keep sipping those coconuts wherever you are.
Wherever you are, keep sipping those coconuts. If you threw your coconut on the floor or on the sand, just ask for a refill. I love coconuts. They're great. We love you guys. We're so glad that you're here. If you're listening, please share it with a friend. Tag us if you happen to share something online. Please go to Apple Podcasts, rate and review because we love to hear from you. Thanks so much for being here, and we will see you all next time. Bye bye.